The War of Scottish Independence is raging on, as after the Scots' victory over the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, the Scots are now in a position to strike back, with William Wallace leading the helm. The hasty retreat of the English out of Scotland has led to several towns and forts to fall back into Scottish hands, most notably the town of Berwick, an important trading port for the Scottish. The Scots would have to hold off any immediate attack into the north of England, as the winter of 1297 was harsh and no meaningful campaign could be conducted. But Wallace still attempted to try and raid the north of England. Wallace sought to attack one of the largest cities in the north of England, Carlisle. The town itself was well defended and fortified, leaving Wallace with no choice but to leave the city behind. Instead, Wallace's forces raided the nearby villages, before heading back towards Scotland along the River Tyne, with the only noticeable stop being at Mitford Castle. With Wallace back in Scotland, he was soon proclaimed the Guardian of Scotland, much to the disdain of some Scottish nobles. Across the border into England, the news has reached Edward Longshanks that his northern army has been defeated, as well as the death of Cressingham. By the 23rd of October 1297, King Edward had ordered the construction of a new army to be made ready for a spring campaign in 1298. A council of war was convened in York to discuss and organise the campaign into Scotland, with all the northern barons and earls in attendance, as Edward was still in Flanders securing a truce with the French, and after sealing the truce, Edward organised levies to be raised from Wales and Ireland. In March 1298, Edward I finally returned to England. With him back in full control, preparation soon picked up the pace, and by June, Edward had moved his government to the north of England. Now, the Scots had the full attention of the English king. With the English army gathered by the end of June, the invasion of Scotland once again began. The most pressing concern for Edward was feeding his vast army, as the Scots were not idle in the time it took him to prepare an army, as the Scots prepared to use scorched earth tactics in order to starve the English into submission. But Edward anticipated such a tactic and took action to avoid this by supplying his army using the English navy to carry supplies back and forth. But like most events that shaped the course of the history of the British Isles, the weather played a vital part in the effectiveness of supplying Longshanks' army, and by the time the English reached Edinburgh, most of the ships had failed to reach the army due to the bad weather. With supplies running low, the English army soon began to starve, and further bad news would lead to a riot in the camp, as one ship did manage to reach the army, but the only cargo it was carrying was wine. Arguments and quarrels soon turned to violence, with fights leading to the death of several English infantry. Edward soon took command of the situation and ordered his men-at-arms to quell the Welsh by killing roughly 80 Welshmen. With fights breaking out and a lack of food, Edward's campaign into Scotland was ending in disaster. If he couldn't find the main Scottish force, he would have to give concessions and orchestrate a humiliating peace with the Scots. Wallace was in fact only 40 miles away at Falkirk, with his army prepped to harass the English as soon as they retreated back towards England. Wallace's plan was working perfectly, but Edward's scouts soon found Wallace with his army and reported back to King Edward. King Edward was ecstatic and proclaimed, "As God lives, they need not pursue me, for I will meet them this day." The English army soon mustered and broke camp, heading straight for Falkirk, and by the next morning, the English could see the Scots positioned on the hill, already pitched and ready to battle, as Wallace had already decided to stand and fight. The Scots had arranged themselves in a tight defensive formation, as the majority of the Scottish troops were pikemen and spearmen, numbered around 6,000 strong, with a few hundred light cavalrymen, as well as a few hundred archers. King Edward's army, when compared to the Scots, was vastly different. For one, his army size was more than double that of the Scots, around 15,000, and featured a variety of different units. Professional men-at-arms. Heavy cavalry from the creme de la creme of English knights. A large amount of infantry. And a new unit that would play a critical role in the future of English warfare, the longbow, specifically the English and Welsh variety, which was normally 6 foot in length. The battle began with the English marching towards the Scots in a 3-line battle formation. The vanguard of heavy cavalry in the front, infantry in the middle, and the Welsh longbow in the third. The nobility were eager to settle the score after Stirling Bridge, and once again ignored the fact that the path towards the Scots involved crossing into marshlands, just like Stirling Bridge. However, this time the English cavalry split into 2 divisions in order to attack the Scots on both flanks, but the boggy terrain still caused issues with coordination, and the English cavalry on the left flank soon started to lag behind, causing the charge of the momentum to falter. But fortunately for the English, the Scottish cavalry soon fled the field after seeing the sheer amount of heavy cavalry heading towards them. With the Scottish cavalry detachment gone, the archers had no defence and were soon cut down. The English cavalry, feeling emboldened, soon turned to attack the Skiltrum, but the remaining Scots stood firm under the assault and soon started to inflict casualties on the English side. King Edward, seeing his cavalry struggling, ordered them to fall back, whilst he ordered his infantry to slowly march towards the Skiltrum. Edward then ordered his longbowmen to fire into the masses of Scots. Soon wave after wave of arrows punctured the Skiltrum, as the Scots had little defence against such a volley and were easy targets for the longbowmen. And after a few hails of arrows, gaps began to form up, and before long the advance and infantry soon attacked. followed by the charge of the heavy cavalry. The Scots didn't hold out for long after these attacks, and soon the battle was over, with the Scots trying to escape towards the forest of Callander. Wallace managed to escape, but the prowess of his image was tarnished, and not long after the battle, Wallace gave up the mantle of Guardian of Scotland, but continued with his campaign of guerrilla tactics against the English. This was a heavy defeat for the Scots, but as King Edward advanced, he still found resistance wherever he went in Scotland, and after a few sieges, the campaigning season of 1298 was over. King Edward was now having to contend with two new Guardians of Scotland, Robert Bruce and John Comyn. The War of Scottish Independence was far from over.